Hello, and welcome to our video series. In this series, I'm joined by special guest Chris Steffen from Enterprise Management Associates. Say hey, Chris.
Hello.
And we're going to be having a conversation and walking a fictional organization through its zero trust journey. And we're going to use actually Chris's favorite fictional organization, which is
Bob's House of Widgets.
Yes. Founded by our favorite CEO, Bob. And we'll talk all about Bob's House of Widgets and kind of where they are from an IT and a security perspective. But the framework we're going to use are the pillars from the system maturity model. So we're going to use each of those to kind of frame this up and then hopefully have some fun and learn some things along the way. So, Chris, let's talk a little bit about Bob's House of Widgets, who is, I believe, a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant for widgets.
Yes, absolutely. When you look at the widget production from Bob's House of Widgets, they are second to none. So, no, I mean, joking aside, I always take and use. I really hope there isn't a Bob's House of Widgets out there. I've always jokingly, for years, decades actually, used Bob's House of Widgets as a fictional joke company, but it always, you can call it, small to medium size. You can call it, enterprise making, 1 billion widgets a day, whatever you want, whatever greenfield, whatever, environment already exists, whatever have you, Bob's got it. Right. And so it's always nice to, not pick on, Bob's Big Bank and Trust. And that's my other one for like the financial services vertical, and Bob's House of Manufacturing, which is just like a generic manufacturing, and so on and so forth. Right. But, yeah, I mean, that's what Bob's House of Widgets is. But so using the hypothetical that way, you can kind of start out, with a clean slate and talk about, the CEO Bob has charged his security team, his IT team, his operations team that, hey, he read about this whole zero trust thing. He understands that Bob's House of Widgets wants to go and obtain government contracts. There's obviously a real push within government spaces and government contractors to be zero trust compliant, whatever that means. And
that's in itself is a whole other.
Yeah. And then so, they're going to initiate a zero trust project, which it's not a project either. So I think starting out baseline, you talk about things like, what is zero trust and what does it mean to go on a zero trust journey? One of the things that I can't hardly stand is the idea of calling it a project. It isn't a project. It is a process in which you accomplish a number of goals through a number of different processes to improve your overall security status within your organization. And it's something that's ongoing. It is something that's iterative. It is something that is done in parallel. It's not a serial one and done kind of thing. This is not for the organization that is interested in checkbox compliance. That isn't. Those are all the things that zero trust is and isn't. And however you define it, I know that, Jason, you wrote a book that has a pretty good definition. Why don't you take a swing at defining zero trust?
Okay, thanks. So I really view zero trust as a security strategy and a philosophy, and it really can and should inform, I would say, a lot, if not all, of your security approach, but really your IT infrastructure and the business processes that support it. And a zero trust philosophy should lead you to an architecture where the access to the network, the access to any resource is by default denied and only allowed after an identity is properly authenticated with the appropriate level of strength. The device is validated to whatever the appropriate level of configuration or posture check, and a dynamic policy is evaluated that looks at a whole set of contextual information about the identity and the device and the network and the resource that's being accessed to then make a decision about should this entity be allowed to access this resource at this given time using the mechanisms that it's trying to do so.
Yeah, and I think let's untangle a couple of points there. One, I think that it's important to realize that it isn't just all about I don't trust anybody to do anything, because that's I guess at the most zero base sum, I guess that's how people kind of think about it. That's really not the goal. The goal is to contextually approve and understand who is accessing resources, and then let's talk about what resources are. Resources aren't just people. That's certainly a component, but you have, things like devices, and you have things like applications, and you have things like data, and all those are various different aspects that take and play in your overall architecture, just like they do right now in your infrastructure that you have now. Bob's House of Widgets, certainly has networking devices, they have cell phones, they have, whatever have you. And so you have computers, but then you also have things like data, and you have applications, and so on and so forth. And those are all things that play into what, the hypothetical John, who is a, the head widget maker at Bob's House of Widgets, who he has the ability to do what he needs to do. It isn't an impediment for John to do his job. That is the absolute last thing that you want. You want John to be able to do whatever John's job is. You just want him to be able to do it safely and within context of wherever he is and whatever he's doing. John is not an HR guy, so he doesn't need to have access to the HR stuff. John is not located in North Korea. So if you see that he's coming in from North Korea, probably not John. I mean, so on and so forth. And a lot of these things are what you would consider to be best practices. When you start taking and putting these best practices all together, you end up with something that approaches zero trust. I always use, again, the hypothetical number where there is, for the cheap seats, let's say there's 30 different things. And very rarely is there a company that's starting out at zero. Very likely you have something, a computer, you have some, identity device, a management solution, you have some kind of network, protocols. And the real first step is, and we'll talk about these steps as we go on through the series, but the real first step is to really kind of consider, and do a strong evaluation of where you are. Get yeah, and across all your stakeholders, right? And we can talk about that a little bit too. But these projects have a tendency of going on and on and on, and so understanding where you are so you can understand where you're going, I think, is critical.
Exactly. And I think we'll be using the pillars in the system maturity model framework to help us look at and assess maturity across those different dimensions.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about Bob's House of Widgets. So it's been around for a while, a number of decades, as you mentioned, and they started off with a pretty traditional on-premises IT infrastructure using, let's say, Active Directory on-premises.
Sure.
Manufacturing company, obviously. So moved from analog manufacturing to digital network devices, et cetera. And in the last, let's say, 10 plus years, they've shifted toward this new line of, we'll call them smart widgets, right? So these things are much more electronic, but they're also connected up to Bob's cloud environment that he's running on one of the major hyperscale providers. And this has been a challenge for them because it's brand new. The security and operations teams are still trying to get their arms around the networking and the security and how all these things connect. And that's part of the challenge that I would say Bob has put forth to the organization, because they've had some outages, they've had some, let's call them minor incidents, that some minor security incidents, and he really wants the organization to do a better job of securing and getting their arms around all this.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start, right? And so, the first thing that Bob and team are going to want to do is get your stakeholders in a room and start having a conversation. And you're not going to, and we'll use another one of those my favorite phrases is, you're not going to eat the elephant, right? You're not going to eat the elephant all at once. This is not something that you're going to finish, even you're not even going to finish planning in one afternoon, much less taking and implementing and so on and so forth. So getting all your stakeholders in a room and start discussing the project is a key. And I'll even go so far to say it's controversial about who's going to be in that room. Your traditional IT people are likely to be in there. Some of your executive management might likely be in there, but let's talk about folks that you may not traditionally consider, like your CFO, like your risk manager, like your chief of operations, like maybe even people like your chief of HR, and so on and so forth. People who aren't generally involved in most security related vision and setting projects and so on and so forth. But in this particular case, these are all people whose organizations are actually stakeholders on whatever the end result of your project is going to be. And I say that you need to include them for two different reasons. One, you honestly can't have enough champions when you're taking and initiating a zero trust journey. Okay, so let's start there. Two, and we can go into that in detail, but and two, one that is constantly interesting to me is when I've done research, for EMA, it's these other organizations in your overall business that actually a lot of times kind of drive your budget. For sure, IT, security, compliance are going to be pretty big budget drivers when you're talking about zero trust and implementation and whatever have you. But don't discount the risk team. Don't discount the operations team. Heck, don't discount the HR team. They have monies that they have allocated to them that they're going to spend or not. And maybe if they buy into what you're trying to do, that makes their lives better, because it will. Maybe they're willing to take and contribute budget to getting that project implemented and seeing it through.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, which is in our fictional organization, I think this holds true in many, even though Bob, who's the CEO, is pushing for zero trust, or maybe he's not pushing, maybe he's curious, there's still constrained budgets and constrained amount of hours in the day. So in this example, I think we should create the story where the organization is investing a lot to create a new line of consumer-focused smart widgets. So now they want to sell 1 million or 100 million of these things to consumers across the world, put them in their homes and do the amazing things that widgets do, and take that data and stick it up into Bob's cloud environment. So this is a big investment by the company. And the security team is, I think, right to, number one, get involved in this, and number two, make sure that they do this properly, because it's going to be technical. There's going to be consumer data that comes in through those widgets, and they want to do this properly. And by connecting to this already invested and really strategically important business initiative, they have the opportunity to do so without having to fight with people, right? You're not pushing a new security initiative from scratch. You're saying, all right, the whole company's on board with these new consumer smart widgets, so let's make sure we have security done properly.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you're going to want to take and get, it's great to have the tone from the top, right? I mean, so Bob is the CEO. Bob is saying, we really need to look at doing this, or at least I want to understand what it means to take and go down a zero trust path. But if you have Bob's buy-in, that's step one. But then step two is getting, this other guy who's the COO in charge of operations, who quite frankly may have the greatest impact on zero trust when it's all said and done, to get his buy-in. If he is adamantly opposed to whatever you're talking about and the things that you want to do, he's looking at all your security initiatives as being, basically roadblocks to him getting his job done, well, then you're going to have problems. You're going to have real problems as a security and IT professional getting your project through your corporation.
So let's pause right there, because that's a really good example, which is the security team in Bob's House of Widgets. If they were to go to the leadership team and say, we're doing this big cloud-based initiative for the consumer smart widgets, and we want to do it properly with security, but it's going to add 5 months to release date, they're going to get kicked out of the room, versus we are doing security properly for this new initiative. And number one, it's not going to add any more time, because it's going to make people more productive, and it's going to make us much more secure and resilient to potential attacks, and let us handle compliance for this consumer data more easily. Then it's a big win.
That's right. It's a hard sell, and you and I've talked about this before, just recently. It's a hard sell to take and say that, it is implementing zero trust equals massive cost savings. Is it possible? Sure. I guess pigs can fly too. I'm not going to say that it's impossible, but that's not really where you lead, right? I think that if you lead with, not only do we have a more secure business that's more modern and more marketable, and potentially, again, maybe Bob is looking to get government contracts that require them to be, zero trust or whatever have you. That's one way of looking at it. But your operations team, all these different personas are going to have different pain points. And if you can convince the operations team that, going through this process is a streamlined process for, your operations team to gain access to the resources that they need. Whereas before we had to go through, 38 different steps of authentication and blah, blah, blah. Now you go through one, and it's contextual, and you can be in the Starbucks in, New York City and still be able to do all this well, or you can be, in a in a hotel in Toronto and still be able to do this. It really kind of is going to empower them to see the benefits. If you take and give them the carrot instead of the stick, it's going to be a happier time for you. I promise.
Exactly. And it's very rare that the security team has a big enough stick to make all this happen
That's for sure.
without the carrots. All right. So I think we're set up here, and I'm excited about taking this journey with Bob and their new, sure to be amazing line of consumer cloud connected smart widgets. Although I may not want one in my home. I don't know about you.
I don't know that I need one either, but I'm really rooting for Bob. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you all for listening. This is part 1 of N, and we'll see how the series goes. I think that we got a lot to talk about, so we're looking forward to it. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.